Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, we talk to Michelle Rapp of Card Kingdom about the color pie and how it relates to certain art movements throughout history. This episode we think is super important because it digs into a real-life parallel for the color pie and color theory in Magic the Gathering, sort of a way for you to relate your understanding of the game to a real-life analogy, or take a real-life analogy that you already know and relate it back to the game and the lore and the flavor of colors. We're super grateful to Michelle for coming on to this podcast. We recorded for about 2 hours in total, so this is split up into 2 different episodes. So, without any further ado, thank you all for listening, and let's get to the show. Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. This week, we are super excited. We are joined by our first guest ever on the show, and she's a doozy. This is... I don't know if that's a compliment. I'm saying it as a compliment, but this is Michelle Rapp. She's a writer for Card Kingdom. She's one of the cast members of another Vorthos podcast, the Loregoyfs. So Michelle is here to talk to us about art movements, how they fit into Magic lore on the whole, but also specifically how they fit into color theory and the color pie. But before we go on to the main topics, I would love my lovely co-hosts to introduce themselves, tell the listeners where they can find you on the interwebs, and what piece of magic art or flavor text resonates with you the most. And why don't we start with you, Michelle?
Well, hello. Thank you for that very lovely introduction. I have to say I'm very flattered by being called a doozy. That's quite something.
Seriously, we're kind of old men on the show. We apologize flat out.
It's swell. It's lovely. So you can find me on the interwebs. I write for Card Kingdom. I also collaborate with the professor. I help write his Tolarian Tutor series. And I also can be found on my Vorthos comedy podcast, the Loregoyfs. We take ourselves extremely seriously as a group of very distinguished, very intelligent Vorthos people, which is why we make lots of Rupture Spire jokes. And so...
This is a family cast. I don't know if we said that.
So you can find me on Twitter at BalefireStrix, as in a bale that's on fire, but also there's an owl involved somehow. So the magic flavor text that really resonates with me is actually one from Dominaria. It's actually the one from Lyra Dawnbringer. And I know it's a really heartfelt, kind of sappy one. It's not the funniest, but it does make me feel like very warm and fuzzy inside. It says, "You are not alone. You never were." And it just makes me feel like Lyra Dawnbringer herself is there with her kick-ass, amazing, glowing stained glass window armor, just like there to give me a very, somehow quite comfortable hug despite all of the plate armor. And it's just great. So... It's a wonderful piece of flavor text. And I think it's one of the best, honestly.
I'm Hobbs Q. I can be found on Twitter at Hobbs Q. My favorite piece of magic art that really resonates right now with me is not actually ever used on a card. It was in a book celebrating the 20th anniversary of Magic the Gathering. We saw this at the Light Gray Art Lab art event recently that was literally fan art and art to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Magic. They had a copy of this book that I had never seen, and in it was a piece by Ed Beard Jr., who was referencing back to his original Nicol Bolas art, and it's literally his updated 20 years later Bolas, and the piece of work is entitled A Good Book. And I think it just really resonates with me to prove that my theories about Bolas are true. All of them.
And what theories are those?
He sparked because people wouldn't let him read.
Oh.
I'm your host, Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Findhorn. That's Fynd Horn. And I've been really digging into Jeff Miracola's work lately because I'm putting together a deck full of his cards that feature his artwork for the upcoming GP Minneapolis. The listeners are going to hear this after the GP, but we're still in that lead up week. But so I've seen a lot of Raging Goblin, and that has been one of my favorite. It's one that's stuck with me forever. It's just fantastic flavor text. He raged at the world, at his family, at his life, but mostly he just raged. And I just, there's something about that where I don't know that it necessarily says something about me. Maybe it does. Maybe there's a deeper psychological discussion to be had about that. But I just love that idea of, yeah, he doesn't really know what he wants, what he's raging about. He's just raging. That's just what he does. That's his whole thing.
I really like that, Michelle, you pointed out the Lyra Dawnbringer one, because we had kind of a discussion yesterday about flavor text and mental health. And the Lyra one got cited as kind of a very popular one that people identified with when talking about their own resiliency and mental health. The other one was from the new Ajani Enchantment, and my mind went blank on the card name.
I know which one you're talking about. It is a...
Presence?
It's...
No?
Yeah, Ajani's Presence or something like that. It's the one with the golden globy bits.
Yes.
Ajani's Welcome is, I believe, what it's called, and it says, pulling it up here, you cannot defend others if your own well-being is neglected.
And it's the real first, yeah. It's one of the best mindfulness quotes that we've seen so far in flavor text. This flavor text was written by another psychologist from San Diego who plays Magic the Gathering.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, so Billy is his name. People probably know him as Billy Sense or Billy San Juan. He is the really, really just Billy Ingrasso. He worked a lot of GPs for both Channel Fireball, Wizards. Him and I worked a pro tour together, which is how I really got to know him. He also writes flavor text for Wizards, recently started, and that was one of his first contributions. So
that's awesome. That's amazing.
A
home run.
So when we're talking about, we've been having more and more episodes. I mean, I'm always kind of trying to bring in the psychological piece. That flavor text is just really stuck out, and the discussion that started from there was really good. But Lyra was one of the other ones that got brought up.
Yeah, and I think those are really resonant with people because of where we are in the world right now. There's a lot going on that is messed up. There's a lot going on that's really daunting and bigger than all of us. And I mean, it's nice to have that game that for a lot of us is an escape, also be something that reinforces who we are or what we want or what we want to be. There's something I want to bring up with that a little bit later as we get into our discussions. But I think that's really great, and it fits with what we're talking about a little bit today in the sense of the color pie and in the sense of philosophy and Hobbs. Like you said, you're always going to bring in the psychology, but fitting in with philosophy and the color pie and White's philosophy is very much that self-care and group care and all that. So I think that's perfect.
Well, when White is at its best.
Right.
Yes. Absolutely. When White is at its best, it is mindful and selfless and caring and compassionate. And at its worst, it's completely intolerant and fascist. So, and conformist, to say the least. Yeah.
So we're getting a little bit of both these days, actually. Which is actually, I think this is a good transition to just jump in here for us. We talked about the color pie, I think, a little bit in previous episodes, but let's kind of explain very, nuts and bolts for somebody who's never dealt with Magic the Gathering before or never dealt with this idea of what the color pie and color philosophy is in Magic, on not just on a game sense, but in a lore sense, in a world building sense. Let's break that down.
When I introduce folks to the color pie, I try to root it as basically the sandbox and the world in which the game is built. I try to liken it to something like Civilization, the game, where you have different leaders with different philosophies on how victory can be attained. And then there's different victories within the game, right? Like you've got your cultural victory, you've got your let's kill everyone victory, and let's go to moon/Mars victory. And the color pie is very similar to that, except instead of like 16 different personalities and also new downloadable content, you basically just have 5 entities that in their own way kind of encompass a lot of the motivations and philosophies that you can find commonly in a lot of world leaders and a lot of different philosophers and in art movements, but kind of help sort of amplify a little bit of different aspects, I think, of human psychology and human, I guess, just various human attributes. So that's generally how I try to couch the entire discussion. And I always go in Wooburg order because, of course, Wooburg, but white. I like to sort of ad-lib Mark Rosewater's articles, which generally starts with white, and white's always the color that wants peace. And peace is, on the surface, can be a great thing. White is, but it doesn't mean that white is a pacifist. It means that it wants, its victory condition is peace and order, and it's willing to find that peace through a structure and a system that makes sense according to the values that that particular person wants to implement and enforce on other people. Not everyone's going to understand it, and everyone's going to get it, but everyone has their own place within the society and understands what they're doing has a greater purpose. It's for their greater good, as, Hot Fuzz might put it. It's the greater good. And so when you think of, and so like we mentioned before, white at its best is egalitarian. It can be incredibly socialist, I suppose, if we're going to throw in some political science terms. It can be extremely benevolent. It can be caring and compassionate. It's a color that sees everyone in its society and wants to make room for that person and make sure that person is provided for. It doesn't mean that person is going to get everything they want, but it does mean that person is going to get everything they need. If we take that structure, though, and invert it and make it such that anyone who thinks outside of the box is immediately excommunicated, like if we look at the blacklist from, I think, like 1930s Hollywood, where we had directors and other folks actually, no, that was 1950s, right? Yeah, it was 1950s. Where we had directors and people in Hollywood being blacklisted because of their supposed communist leanings, where we basically have an environment that doesn't encourage diversity of thought, that any threat to the greater good would come from the individual. So squashing that out immediately as soon as possible is imperative for a not necessarily maliciously aligned white force, but definitely, they're not super interested in self-expression, artistic expression that speaks to anything other than the greater values. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about, like the McCarthyism. It's kind of that there's orders and there's laws, and whatever the prevailing thought at that moment needs to be conformed to. So
yeah.
Radicals or anybody that's kind of going to have these really more extreme views in the opposite of groupthink really need to be brought into line, which is white at its not so good end.
Yes, and it's a really powerful thing, though, and that's one of the reasons why white is such an incredibly powerful color. When you unite so many disparate elements into a single goal and concentrate all your efforts in that direction, it is something that's incredibly terrifying. But on the other hand, if you have everybody's like this sort of mindless cult person, that's not going to be super great either.
Right. A perfect example of that downside of white, the negative part of white, is Kamigawa. The main villain, the main antagonist, was a white character. And now he's slipping my mind. Is it Konda? Thought that the best thing for his people to do would be kidnap a creature from the kami, the kami egg, which became, blah, blah, blah. Long story, Kamigawa.
Kami, not communist. Gotcha.
Right. Not commies, kami.
I was like, we're really going
kami.
Deep this
on the
time
McCarthy.
with the socialism.
Conda, McCarthy, I mean, it's close, But yeah, no, I think that's a perfect example of it. He thought that the best way to benefit his people would be to do that. However, he gave no consideration to other groups. He gave no consideration to the balance of the world. It was this small, sort of protecting his people, his power in that way.
So, I know we're already just on white, but we're introducing this larger concept of the color pie right now. So I think I want to just interject a little bit with one thing that we've talked a little bit on the show before about is this concept of continuums versus dichotomies. And I think that it's important to realize that when we're going to be talking about all of these colors, at their essence, these colors boiling down to their individual white, blue, black, red, green. No overlap, no looking at color combinations, which is something that makes the color wheel and the color pie in general just completely complex. But even looking within individual colors, we kind of see that white, for instance, can have this extreme order at one end and this more morality or this kind of, like we've talked about, this peace, this mindfulness, this, holiness in some ways, in which we've seen. These are kind of continuums, so you can move between them, and that's where I think we're going to be talking a lot about this in general. But the goal for me is always to find the balance, and that where you get into trouble is when you start getting to the extremes of both ends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. As a slight segue, I was actually thinking about artistic expressions within white on the darker side of things. The first thing that came to mind was Triumph of the Will, which was a Nazi propaganda film that was one of the first of its kind to really do like these incredibly silly long takes of like people marching forever, deliberately angling shots such that the soldiers looked amazing, and really just celebrating the Aryanness of what the motherland ought to be under this government, and that's sort of, I think, how art sort of works in a purely mono white world. It is to some extent propaganda, because it is, that's the only kind of expression that could exist in a mono white universe. It's basically art that glorifies the status quo. And that's sort of the problem with white as a color. White is not adaptable. It is the least adaptable of all the colors. Peace is a good thing to have, but when you have dead quiet, it means that there is no sound. There is no ability to make noise. You can't change things. Things are static. White very much loves to, that's why you have a lot of white enchantments and edicts and whatnot, just lay down the law and keep that law there almost in perpetuity. And so the flexibility of white just is not there. And it's one of the reasons why, you have characters like Gideon, like Johnny, have such a hard time looking inside and figuring out how to change those particular flaws within themselves. And they also can be really judgmental. Yeah.
And coming from that art perspective, you bringing up Triumph of the Wills reminds me, you talked about the shots and the way that they were done from angles to make the soldiers look beautiful and to make it look strong. A lot of controversy has been had over the director of the film, because even people such as Spielberg and George Lucas had talked about like her contributions to cinema. Leni Riefenstahl, if I remember if that's the pronunciation.
Leni Riefenstahl. Riefenstahl. Yeah.
No, it's a really controversial thing because we have these big name directors, one of whom Spielberg is, obviously directly impacted by the Holocaust, talking about how do you separate the art from the person, which is something I've been struggling with a lot.
The death of
over
the
last
author
couple of years.
question. Yeah, the death of the author question is very much a question that kind of almost, it's interesting because so if you ask each of the different colors that question, each of them would have a completely different answer. And that's what's really interesting about the color wheel. So if you ask white, like, does the author's intent count towards the interpretation of the piece, then white would absolutely say yes, because white looks at the whole, white looks at the artist and the creator and sees an indelible, inviolate link between both the work and its creator. Blue would maybe be on the edge there. Blue might say no, because blue is more about like how does this piece like push forward and progress the field as a whole, and how does it exist in, I guess, contention with other ideas within the same space. Black would just be black. I think would also maybe agree with white and say that the author does have some kind of relationship there, and that they do matter because you have to see how this piece benefits and amplifies the voice of the artist. Red might just be like, who really cares? And because red is all about freedom of expression, and at the end of the day, it's that freedom that counts, the fact that they were able to do that action that counts, rather than necessarily the product or the person who did it. And green is kind of like, it's there, it's just part of the fabric of things. They are both equal, and but they're not as important as the larger context of how this piece is regarded. And so, sorry, I just kind of went on that weird tangent there because it was like, that's an interesting question.
What's funny is I was
that.
just going to compliment you on your transition. I thought you were going to move just straight into blue. And either way, that idea of like moving to how the other colors would answer that question was way smoother than most of our transitions on the show.
I mean, what's interesting about blue and art is that blue is, I think, more, it's like, if I think of a blue artist, I think of like the Italian Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci, because he was technically amazing. Like if you look at his the way his brushstrokes, the lighting, that soft like haziness that he manages to achieve around his pieces, he's got that perfect like trifecta thing going on. I don't know if you noticed, but like in a lot of Renaissance art, you've got like three people looking at each other, and it's like supposed to represent perspective and also like the Holy Trinity and things like that. But he's also like the creator of the Vitruvian Man. He created like the first tank. He's not someone who's like constrained by any particular morality. He's interested in using his artistic talents to pursue knowledge and the furthering of ideas that he has. I mean, he's like one of the first people to, I think, actually do an autopsy, right? Yep. So yeah, and that's and so it's amazing. So he's not like, sure, he made the Mona Lisa, but when we think of Leonardo da Vinci, we don't really think about him the same way we say like Gustav Klimt. Klimt was all about like let's play around with perspective and flatness and texture and shine. That I think is very, very different than like the way Da Vinci was very much all about like, okay, how do I use my beautiful drawing, sketching technique in order to capture the way a man's liver is placed in his chest cavity?
Well, I mean, I was just thinking when you brought up Da Vinci, to me that epitomizes blue when we're talking about art. I mean, we have somebody that's known as a master painter for both The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. I mean, for at least those two pieces, just alone, I am somebody who's way more drawn to, I would love to have around our house like a Vitruvian Man or some of the flying machines or the tanks and the drawings that are based in mathematics that look at the symmetry of the human being, almost look like old med school text. I mean, my wife and I have talked about this, like wanting to have that kind of old art that was used in medical textbooks, because we didn't have these photos of a liver. You know what I mean? Like we didn't have a just easy way to look at that. And so if you look at the old, even Grey's Anatomy, the original, I mean, I love the old scientific drawings that were just so technically beautiful from a sketch standpoint, but were also purposeful to educate and to teach.
Yeah, no, and I actually, when I was studying at Cornell, I had the good fortune of studying under a professor who's one of the most well-renowned botanical artists, like scientific botanical artists in the world. And it's just like when she talked about how the process by which she goes into creating an illustration, it's not about trying to capture like light. It's about trying to capture the components of this particular plant, of this particular piece, and help explain it in an educational way towards to the viewer, to the audience. And so it's a very different message in that particular case. But it's not that Blue's also interested in like empathy as well. And so I think that's what's really cool about like pieces that I'm trying to think of like a really strong empathic piece. Like I almost think like Guernica is probably maybe by Pablo Picasso is somehow like Blue, and its desire to kind of show you the horrors of what's going on, albeit in a very abstract way, but it really presses upon you the importance of the disaster and the sadness and the waste of the people who died in this particular incident, just because the Nazis were like, oh, well, we just kind of want to test out our planes, so we're going to bomb this tiny town. And yeah, so I think that there are different aspects of Blue, and like there were in White, but I think Blue has a little bit more flexibility, not as much as say Red, but I think there's a lot there that can be played with in terms of just using art as like not just as a tool of expression, but also of education.
So I had a gut reaction to that about Guernica. I'm not going to lie.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
no worries.
I totally was like, okay, I can go with this, the blue. And yet I'm seeing, to me, I guess I now we're getting into where we either talk about guilds or we talk about these pairs of colors. And I mean, I think that my reaction was
no.
that my impulsivity, my emotions, I am pulling this, like the passion that led to him painting that.
It's primary Red, but I think that the visceral reaction is at least the empathy aspect. Yeah.
No. And I mean, and this is why the color pie in general, it is the founding block for Magic. I mean, it is what Richard Garfield intended. We always say that, but I mean, he had this idea behind it, and it's been codified, and it's really been strengthened over the years. So the color pie really kind of defines a lot behind how we play the game, and it's just fascinating to me because we're seeing, like you said, your reaction to it versus the creation of it could have been along very different axes. So I was wondering if you want to finish up on the blue portion. I mean, we've talked a little bit about it, but just thinking of, I really want to move into black. I don't know. I want to
move into black too, actually. It's my favorite color.
Then we're hitting my side of the color pie. So
yeah, no, I hear you. White and black are my favorite colors. So, but black being like the top here. I think art in black is all about the celebration of the self, and I think the epitome of art within black is the portrait. It primarily like. You know those like older portraits done by Vermeer, the Dutch masters, as well as Italian, like the Medicis. You basically have a person standing there surrounded by symbolic objects, expressing their power and like what industries they're involved in. Is basically just like a resume, but on not even a resume. It's like a look at me, look how awesome I am with my sumptuous silks and the fact that I have salt.
It's a painting version of the Egyptian pharaoh tombs, basically. I mean, it's all of the things that you want to show everybody. Look, this is what I've got. Yeah,
it's a display of power. Is the heart of portraiture, and that it's been that way for such a long time. I mean, who has portraits? People who we're sitting down and commissioning people to actually paint them. So the Vanderbilts, the Rothschilds, I mean, Gustav Klimt, as I mentioned before, did a number of portraits for like very well-renowned like ladies of like French and Italian society. And so it's kind of a big deal. It's there to show things off. It's also there to show off like your beauty and like what you can afford, which is really amazing, which is what I mean, if we contrast this, for example, with like the portraits that not portraits so much, but like the snapshots of like Toulouse-Lautrec in the Moulin Rouge, he would often do like pictures of like, I would say this is Toulouse-Lautrec is more red green personally, but he's definitely very red when he like shows off these pictures and like moments of dancers who probably are also ladies of negotiable affection on the side. They're not anyone super important in like
family show. Family.
I'm sorry, we're talking about art, and that's going to inevitably rub up against some things.
Whoa,
wow.
Rub up against
Literally.
Oh man, it's off the rails.
But yeah, like I just think the portrait is such a perfect thing for Black. That and like also like intricate works of craft. Like I think that, you know, things like Fabergé eggs and whatnot, it's such like a Black thing to have. Like, look at me, I have a freaking egg made of crystal and gold with a tiny little thing that makes tiny pigs inside. Like, I have no idea, you know, like it's just insanity.
Well, that's kind of why I loved when we went to Kaladesh in Magic and we got to see Gonti. You know, the Aetherborn sort of crime syndicate leader. His card title literally is Gonti, Lord of Luxury. And all he does is collect these beautiful pieces of art and artifacts. And, you know, he adorns himself with all of these intricately wrought, you know, metal filigree plates and a mask and all of these things. I mean, that to me is that sort of... like you said, the De Medici sort of, you know, adorn yourself, adorn your life, you know, show your power through what you have.
Black is very extra when it comes to art. so very extra. Just the most extra. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bringing up the Medici kind of reminded me, Michelle just talked about her favorite being the black-white combination. And I really hit on that when we're talking about people who would have, like, be patrons. And it's because they want to be able to afford the best people to make their art or be able to afford the best portraits of themselves, which kind of reminds me of the Orzhov.
Oh yeah, totally. Like when you think of, I keep bringing up Klimt because I just saw a tiny documentary on him, but like he freaking used like gold leaf on his paintings. He's known for it, and that was just a show of like, look at how bougie I can make your portrait. And I mean, like I think that's true for the Medicis too. When you look at like any of their paintings, like making lapis into or making pigments is just such an onerous task, and the skill and the money involved to just create such a thing. It's such an expression of power, and that's what Black loves the most. It's the reason why I think Liliana is the most well dressed of the Gatewatch, because she knows that looking good is another subtle way of grabbing power. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I have to say on Black, because it's just so succinct like that. But yeah, like big statues to yourself, that's very Black.
I feel like there's a lot of Black in architecture too, depending on how it's used. You know, some of those beautifully. Like you were saying, the gold leaf that Klimt used on his paintings. I mean, there's a lot of those. Gosh, it's been so long since I've had an art history class. The name of Louis XIV's palace.
Versailles?
Thank you. Yes, Versailles. Oh my gosh. But imagine being somebody walking into the court of the Sun King and you're just blown away by how much opulent wealth there is literally dripping from the walls.
I mean, that's a tradition that continues until today. I mean, when you look at Times cover, you know, with like your portrait being taken by Anne Leibovitz or someone else, and your face is on there as the notorious new Time Person of the Year, or I don't know you.
Or MTV
if
Cribs. I mean, that's,
yes,
like,
yes,
for all you millennials out there.
yes. I'm just gonna be over here with my avocado stash.
But yeah, no, absolutely. It's that opulence. It's that example of power, and I think that's perfect.
Red is freaking like the fountain by
It's the Dada.
Duchamp.
Yeah, it's the Dadaist.
It's Dada. It's a Dadaist. It's a surrealist. It's the modernist. Like
the futurists even too. And this is can we talk about continuum here with Dada and futurism and that I think futurism is Red at its worst. And I have a big opinion on this. But so futurism essentially was thinking about how we can take the concepts of speed and power and, travel and progression and machine and condense it down into art. And, on the surface of that, I think that's a really fascinating and compelling concept. Mayakovsky was a Russian futurist, and Tommaso Marinetti was an Italian futurist, and both of them had really fascinating perspectives on this form. They would take. I mean, it was a little bit, they had some ideas that were similar to Cubism or execution that was similar. They had really fractured, splotches of color on paintings, and a lot of it was just trying to capture that idea of what is something zooming past your eye. How do you make that a crystallized moment? Really, some of their best stuff in my mind is sculpture, but the philosophy behind it is so, it's so. It's a little bit of, it's Red at its worst in that it's all about passion and fury, and it's Raging Goblin. It's passion and fury and rage, at the cost of anything else. It's burn it all down. It's burn it all down so we can build something new, but then it's build something new so we can burn it all down again. And that to me is that darker side of where Red goes.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted, this is just a random fact because what you're bringing up a little bit with this is the chaos nature of Red, but there is and can be order to it. The reason I bring this up when it comes to art movements is one of the most fascinating things that I learned recently, and I don't know if either of you have heard about this. If you want, Joe, I can send you the article so that it can be loaded.
Please do.
You guys know who Jackson Pollock is, obviously,
of course,
right? Okay, Jackson Pollock is famous for our listeners. If you haven't seen his work, he did drip paintings, and he's also kind of known for being that kind of the person that everybody's like, my kids could just do that, drip paint onto a can, throw it all over the wall. I don't know if you guys know this, but they actually can use fractal analysis, which is within chaos theory and mathematics, fractals are these complex, very ordered, in some ways, designs that look random or chaotic at first. Using fractals, they can actually validate whether something is or is not a Jackson Pollock painting.
What?
Almost
Stop
like,
applying blue to my red paintings, yo.
Right. But I mean, there is kind of this that shows that they are fractal. The fingerprint of nature they talk about, but there actually has been use of this to validate or to kind of show that some of the paintings were his in terms of people trying to pass off work or show them. So we again get the complexity of art, and even within chaos, and we've talked about chaos theory on this cast before, and that you can have order out of chaos. And I think that when we're talking about art within a Red realm, even something like drip painting, there is a whole study of nature on fractals that talk about why we find them pleasing to the eye, and that even chaos can be calming or look beautiful to the eye.
But what I love about, so I actually do have a soft spot for this Dadaists and surrealists and the artists of Fluxus, because they, and Duchamp, because they are pushing expression. They are all about expression and the egalitarian nature of everyone is entitled to making art. regardless of who you are. And the artist I actually think of whenever I consider like red at its purity and in terms of art is Yoko Ono. And I know she gets a lot of hate, but so Yoko Ono was one of the first artists to do it's almost like prescriptive art. So basically there, for example, like so she would create these instruction manuals basically of just like of you to create, like this is how you create art. I think one was like light a match, hold it until the flame goes out, watch the smoke dissipate. And that was the piece, that was the performance. And it's like she took that performance art to the next level and really kind of helped invite people to come in and to share that space with them, because for so long art has been this conversation, this one-sided conversation between the artist and the audience. And now, for example, when she did Cut Piece, which was a performance piece that she did back in the 1960s, she basically sat there and had people cut off pieces of her clothing using scissors. And it was a very interesting setup because she was basically inviting people to come and interact with her in a really close physical setting. It almost reminds me of Marina Abramovic. She is another very well-known performance artist. She did Living Door, where she and another guy, they were naked and they were standing in the doorway of this door. And the people who were invited to this exhibit had to pass between the two of them. And so it really helped people challenge and engage with this idea of like, what is privacy? How do I feel as I go through this door? How does this challenge my norms? Like, are my norms of like what private space is, like, are they even valid? And that's what I really love about this aspect of I guess the art history. It's just this idea of constantly challenging what it is to create art. What is the intent of the artist? How does the audience engage with the artist? And how much should art be an institution versus for the people? And I think that's just what's really brilliant about this particular aspect of history, even though it's kind of weird and consists of like eggs and very randomly recorded instruments and paint. So
that's our show. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Goblin Lore Pod. You can email us any questions, comments, or concerns at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. You can find Joe Redeman at Findhorn, that's FYND Horn, on Twitter. You can find HobbsQ at HobbsQ. And you can find Alex at Alexander New M. One last bit of business before we go. We do have a giveaway to announce. Thanks to reaching our 200 follower goal on Twitter, this giveaway, we are going to be giving away an original Magic paperback novel that may or may not have a little gift tucked in alongside as a bookmark. And so our random draw winner here is Max. That's at MTG_JLP on Twitter. So Max, get in contact with us. Let us know where we can send your prize to, and we'll have a couple of choices for you as well. For everyone else, please keep retweeting the episodes of the show. Please tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is the best way to spread news about a podcast. So if you like what we're doing, please let other people know. And when we get to 300 followers, we will have another giveaway. Thank you all for listening. And remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.